Hello, in this video I will be demonstrating how you can combine animating effects with visuals that are also being animated. I'm Darren May, President and co-founder of Crank211. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Windows development. Crank211 designs and delivers universal Windows applications, web applications, cross-platform mobile, and we also develop and deliver training courses. You can find me on Twitter at Darren May and on the web at www.crank211.com. So in this video we're going to add an animated effect control to our existing Effect Explorer application. Now if you recall from a previous video, our Effect Explorer application lists a series of effects that we can bring into bear, for example the blur effect, and we can have a UI that controls parameters on those effects and so on. What we're going to do this time is we're going to create an effect that instead of occupying the entire surface of our webcam output, we're going to drop a rectangle into the center, and that's going to have a blur and a color effect, and then we're going to animate rotation and lateral offset, and then we're going to animate the blur effect property and see how that can create some interesting effects. So let's close that down. Now, if you recall from the previous video, we created an infrastructure where we have a base effect control class that we then inherit in subsequent user controls. The quickest way for us to create a new one of these would be to just copy a simple effect control, such as blur effect, and then rename it. So let's do that. Just copied and pasted. Let's rename this to be animated effect control. We now need to make sure we update our classes. So this is animated effect control. Let's copy that because I'm going to use that in the constructor. And also need to rename the XAML class reference. While we're in here, we actually don't need a slider UI in this particular one, so let's just drop in a text block that says, let's actually use a text block rather than a made-up control. Text block with the text, we'll just say no UI, but because I can't just leave it by default, I'm going to drop a style in there with a static resource of the title block style, and we'll put a margin of 12 so it's not sitting right up against the edge. Okay. So that's my UI set up. Now let's have a look at the code behind. So if you recall, we usually have our class inherits from base effect class, and in our base effect control we have defined an effect visual. But this effect visual is set up by default to occupy the entire region. So rather than worrying about how we're going to deal with that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new visual, and we're going to call this one animated visual. So in order to use that, we need to create a field. Now, because we're actually creating a new sprite visual in here, we want to make sure that we're managing its life cycle. And we thought of that when we created our base class, in that we created an override that we can call when we remove an effect. And so what we'll do is we'll just drop in here to say if we haven't yet got rid of our animated visual, i.e. it's not equal to null, then we are going to dispose it, and we'll set it to null just for good measure. Okay, I often think it's useful to remember to tidy up when we create something rather than leave it lying around and forget to do it later. The other thing we want to make sure is that we use our animated visual instead of the effect visual when we apply our brush. Okay, so now let's think about what we wanted to do. We want to actually create a rectangular visual that sits in the middle of our webcam output. So rather than it being full size, we know it's going to be a specific size. So let's set it up to be a new vector 2, and let's make it 200 by 200. As we're also going to be performing some rotation animations, and we want those things to be related to the center of the visual, we're going to set up its anchor point. If we set its anchor point to new vector 2, And if we remember from a previous video when we talked about anchor point versus center point, anchor point is normalized. So we can say 0.5f means halfway across the horizontal. 0.5f means halfway across the vertical dimensions. So this will place it in the center without us having to precisely calculate the dimensions of the visual, which is very useful for us. So that's created the visual. Now we want to do an effect. So let's copy this for the time being. We want to create a new blend effect, and you may remember us using this before. Set up some properties on here. We want our blend mode. So we want to use soft light because we liked how that looked last time. So here's our soft light. And then you may also remember that blend has a background source, which we're actually going to use a new color source effect, and we're just going to set that to a very bold color so we can easily see what it is, and we want to set that to just bright red. Let's actually bring in colors, namespace, so we got red, and now we want to set up our foreground. And we're going to use our Gaussian blur that I just copied. And let's put a semicolon on R. But we don't want to set hard code a blur amount. We're actually going to set that in our properties. So we've got a blend effect that is taking the red and then taking the background, or will take the background and blur it. Now this isn't the background of the entire webcam area, obviously. This is just the background that lies behind our visual, which is only 200 by 200. Our visual, however, is not yet positioned, so we'll sort that out in a second. But the other thing I want to do is set up a default value for our blur effect. And the way we can do that is we can get into our effect brush. So rather than actually putting it hard-coded up in our Gaussian blur definition, I can get our properties. Then I can say insert scalar, the string, which is going to be blur effect dot blur amount, and specify the value, which let's say is going to be 20. So if you recall, insert scalar will insert a value into this property set if it doesn't already exist, or replace the value if the value is already there. So by default, it's probably blur amount is 0 because I haven't initialized it up here. So this is going to change it to 20. Okay, the other thing that we want to worry about is we want to position our visual. So let's create a method to do that. And let's replace resize visual. This is in our base class, and this is responsible for making our visual always match the size of our webcam output. Obviously we're not doing that, so let's just get rid of this and let's create a new method, position visual. Let's create that method. Now you may recall beforehand, because of timing and so on, it's possible that this position visual could be called before our animated visual has been created, and that's more related to tracking size changes on our underlying element. So we want to do a guard if this is equal to null, then we'll just return. Then we'll set up our size. So position even, I want to set up the offset. The offset, and it's going to be a new vector 3. And if you recall from the previous video, we have a target element property on our base class, which represents our webcam output. Target element, and we want our actual width, and we want to divide that by 2 float, and cast float again. We want our target element actual height divided by 2 float, and we're not worrying about our z value. Okay, so that's set up our position visual. So that will work the first time we do it, but what about when our target element resizes? Well, glad you asked. Let's make sure that we set up a change event on our target element. So let's do that in our build brush. because we know at this point our target element has been set. Size changed plus equals this element times size changed. Let's go to that definition. So all we need to do here is call our position visual. But as we've just added a subscription to the size change event, we want to make sure that we unsubscribe from that when we dispose of our brush effects and so on. So let's come down here in the custom remove effect. Let's unsubscribe from that, minus equals. That way we don't hang on to any references. We're obviously not using blur slider on value change, so let's delete that. So we should be in a position where we've set everything up. Oh, no, I've just spotted something. I need to make sure that I add my animated visual to my child element, or my child visual is of my target element. So let's do that. Now let's make sure that we've registered this effect in our effect source. So let's open that up. Okay, so we just copy the previous entry. Let's change this to animated effect, even though it's not animated as yet. Let's add that control in here. So now let's run and see what we have so far. Okay, select our animated effect. Tells us we have no UI. We can see that we have our rectangle in place, and we can see that it's blurring and it's doing the color tint and everything along those lines. Let's resize our window. So we can see that it repositions itself in the center, so it's responding to the size change events and so on. Okay, great. Let's close that down. Now let's look at starting to add some animation into here. So first of all, let's animate the visual, and let's do something like rotate the rectangle. Okay, so here we have, this is where we set up our visual and our brush. So let's add some animations beneath here. So let's start off by creating a rotation animation. So let's call it rotate animation. We use our compositor to create a scalar frame, scalar keyframe animation. Okay, we're going to use a easing function. So let's create that easing function as well. Compositor, create easing. So we want our linear easing. Then let's start actually setting up our animation. So rotate animation, we're going to insert a keyframe. And if you remember, it's normalized, so 1.0f represents the full duration of the animation. So we're going to rotate in degrees. So we'll specify we're going to go to 359 degrees. And we're going to use our linear easing to make this nice and linear. We're going to specify a duration using time of. So we want this to be reasonably slow so we can see the effect going on. So we're going to do time span. What should we do it from seconds? Let's do it for a couple of seconds. Okay, so we've got that. Let's specify our iteration behavior. So what we now want to do is we want this to run on forever. Just continually rotate. And we might as well start it up. So we're going to specify that we're going to perform this on our animated visual. And we want to start an animation. And the property name of what we're going to be updating, it could be a string. Let's use name of, because as you've all seen, my typos. So it's going to be visual. And as I mentioned before, we're going to rotate this in degrees. And this is the animation we want to use, which is rotate animation. Okay, so we've added this into the our visual itself. So now let's run it. And what we should see is that the effect will continue to be applied as we rotate our visual. Okay, so as we can see, here is our visual rotating on top of our background, and we can see that it is applying the effect dynamically as I bubble my head around, so you can see how that's working. Now, one thing you may see is that there is a little bit of a lag sometimes in the update, and I've been talking throughout these videos how high performance the composition is. So the video itself may not be capturing this slight lag on some of these areas, but you may see it when you're running live yourself. This, I've been told, is related to the fact that the composition system has a throttle set on the processing of the create backdrop brush, so that it stops you from overloading the composition system with doing a lot of these effects. So the fact that we've got this particular animation running and my system is running quite busy right now, this may be contributing to the fact that we're going to see this throttling. The fact that I've actually hit this and I've actually sent feedback into the composition team about this, they'll be looking and seeing if there's some tweaking they might want to do on this animation system to actually improve that. It's not a typical use case where you'd be rotating the visual, because if you think about what's going on, it has to rotate the background brush opposite to the direction of the rotation of my rectangle to ensure that the background frame is still aligned appropriately. So there's a bunch of work that needs to go on. But anyway, I'd call that out. You may not see it. But what we do have is a dynamically applied effect to a rotating animation. Let's add another animation to this where we're going to use an offset. And one thing that I have noticed is the more animations we have on there, the less noticeable some of this, the jitter that I was just talking about appears. So let's create an offset animation. So let's do the compositor. We're going to create another vector 3 animation this time around. Keyframe animation. So we're going to create a number of frames, because what we're going to do here is we're going to move it to the left, to the right, and back. So offset animation, we're going to insert a keyframe, and we could calculate what dimensions we want this to be, but what we'll actually do is just set some hard-coded values. So what we're taking is the current position, and we're also going to use our linear easing here. Then let's add another keyframe, and this is halfway through the duration of the animation, and we're going to perform some vector arithmetic using an overloaded operator. So a new vector 3. It would be interesting if we could subtract a visual from a vector. So now we're going to turn around and say we're going to add 300. So we're going to move it to the right 300. We're going to have no net impact on the Y or the Z. Actually, let's make that 2.5. We'll make this 7.5. So quarter of the way through the animation, we'll move it to the right 300. 3/4 of the way through the animation, we'll move it to the left 300, so that'll move it back through its original position, and then out 300 the opposite direction. And then finally, we'll return it to its original position. So this will be 1, and we're back to where we started from. Let's set our iteration behavior. So offset animation. Again, we want this to carry on forever. And again, we want to set our duration. Use time span again. Let's do it 2 seconds as well. And once again, we're going to set it up on our animated visual. So let's just copy this line down here, take offset animation, drop it in here. And obviously we're not rotating, we're updating the offset. Okay, so let's have a look and see what we've got going on here. Select our animated effect, Oh, we're not moving from side to side. Oh, that's because I forgot to move the position. Let's come back in here. I have this position visual. If you remember from a previous video when we talk about stomping of offsets and so on, this position will change the offset without using the animation, and that stops this animation from running. So I'm just going to move it up. So let's drop that up here. You'll remember that there's ways to address this by enabling an element for translation and so on and doing that instead. I'm just doing this simply, so let's just rerun this and we should see our transparent blurry rectangle moving from side to side. Select animated effect. Okay, so now we see this moving from side to side. We can again see that the effect is being applied dynamically as it moves over, and if you were seeing issues where the background brush wasn't keeping up, you probably won't see it in this. Okay, so that's great. What I've shown is how you can animate the visual with an effect being applied to it, but how can we then go ahead and animate the the effect itself? So change properties of the effect. So let's create a blur animation. So we're going to use the compositor to once again create ourselves a scalar keyframe animation, because we're going to be animating our blur amount, which is a scalar value. We are going to be creating frames. So let's create our blur animation frame, insert keyframe, timeline 0 position, value of 0 for blur, and we're going to use our linear easing function. Let's copy these a couple of times. So what we're going to do is halfway through our duration, 0.5, we're going to be at 20 blur, and then at the full time of our animation, we're going to have reset our blur back to 0. Let's copy our iteration and duration, because we'll have it iterate forever and run for 2 seconds. Let's make sure we update our animation that we're updating. Now, if we look at line 80 and copy that down, previously we were animating using our visual. This time around, we're actually going to animate using our effect brush. So we're going to effect brush, and we're going to access the properties of our effect brush, and we're going to start the animation from there. We're actually going to animate the same property that we're inserting up here, which is our blur effect, blur amount. So if we come down, we can get rid of the name of, and specify blur amount, and then we obviously want to make sure that we're updating our blur animation. Now I'm actually temporarily going to disable our offset animation just so that we can see much easier the animation of the blur effect. So let's run this. Select our animated effect. So now we have just our rotating visual, and we can see that the blur is increasing and decreasing, increasing and decreasing. So if I close that down, re-enable our offset. Okay, let's run this. Select the animated effect. So now you can see we've combined the offset and the rotation animations as well as the blur. You may not be able to see it necessarily in this video, but if you're running along on your own machine, you should see that the blur is also being applied. So what we've demonstrated here is how we can simply combine visual-based animations with rotations and offsets and so on with effect-based animations. Now clearly I've just shown a very simple scenario where I'm animating a single property of an effect, but there's no reason why you cannot animate multiple effects with multiple properties on each of those effects and combine all of those things into interesting experiences within your application. And that's the end of this video.